Welcome to What is Life? Permanent Mergers, Bacteria to Protists. This is a book that I would recommend. It's out of print, but if you have a chance, you can probably get it used. Her name is Lynn Margulis, and the book is What is Life? It's just fantastic, great pictures, the whole thing. But we're now going to talk about what's the difference between the kingdom of Monera, which is bacteria, and how did it get to be a eukaryotic, more complicated kingdom like Protista. Um, and away we go. The other thing I meant to mention is that this is for my Thursday lab group because of the unending freezing drizzle and my not being able to get up my driveway. So if anybody else wants to listen, great. It was covered in Tuesday's lab, but obviously not on Thursdays because we didn't have lab. So this is the makeup. Here we go. So we're going to begin with bacteria. They are the first to emerge in the primordial soup, and now what's going to happen is they're going to hit a few bumps in the road, and eventually the bumps in the road will lead to different solutions, which will lead to a different kingdom, which will lead to a different cell. So I am not going to read the PowerPoint slides to you. I'm just going to comment on them. We know that bacteria are simple, they're prokaryotic, they're in the kingdom Monera. We know that they can change by mutation, but they don't have the ability to have the diversity that we have because they're more simple. And they can also trade genes with each other, and that gives them some diversity. But they only divide by binary fission. They get big, they divide in half. And yes, some of them can live in a colony with other bacteria, but it's with other bacteria. And so let's talk about the first metabolic crisis that the bacteria are going to have. The problem is starvation. They eventually ran out of high energy fuel. They had no way of regenerating a low energy end product into a high energy fuel for consumption. They had no way of recycling. And due to that, they were anaerobes. There was absolutely no oxygen on the earth yet. And when you anaerobically break down the high energy fuel, you only make 2 ATP. We, on the other hand, take glucose and make 38. And that's going to be a huge difference in evolution. It's hard to evolve if you can't generate a lot of energy to do synthetic things, make things. So the solution to this metabolic crisis of now starving because you've used up all the high energy fuel and the only thing you've dumped into the ocean is low energy fuel is the advent of the cyanobacteria. And they learned photosynthesis. They were able to make a pigment, chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is able to trap the energy of the sun and then to make a lot of ATP as a basically using the sun as an energy source. Then they were, I'm sorry, let's go back, sorry. So when they did that, they generated, free of charge, lots of glucose, high energy, fantastic. Another byproduct of photosynthesis was oxygen. Now, great for us, not great for anaerobic bacteria. They actually are poisoned by oxygen. The solution was that now we're talking about the primordial sea. The anaerobes had to sink down a little bit further in the ocean because, well, thank God, oxygen is great in the atmosphere. It does not dissolve well in water. So as long as they sunk down low enough, then they were not poisoned anymore. And then the cyanobacteria floated on the surface, got the sunlight, and the oxygen started to build up. And that seemed to be fine, except the solution to one problem brings about a second problem. And the second metabolic crisis is that now the oxygen is building up and there's nothing to really consume it. Um, if you now the oxygen levels on the planet 20%, and that's good for us, it's good for the other life on the planet that consume oxygen. When you get over 25%, things start to spontaneously combust. Oxygen is very, very flammable. And so with oxygen gas building up, you would end up just burning the earth. So you had to have some creature evolve into the role of utilizing the oxygen. And that is the evolution of aerobic bacteria. And that became the foundation for our metabolism because we consume oxygen. And when you had bacteria like aerobic bacteria that could do aerobic respiration, then they were able to consume the oxygen and the high energy fuel of the glucose. And then they were able to break it down, make 38 ATP, and then make the CO2 in the water as byproducts, end products of aerobic respiration. And luckily for everyone, that became the products that the end products of aerobic respiration became the initial molecules that photosynthesis used in order to make the high energy glucose and the oxygen. So that was a fantastic solution, and we are using that solution as I speak. So this is just to show you the coupling between these two. So here's your cyanobacteria. They can do photosynthesis. They can trap the energy of the sun, and their initial consumption of CO2 and water, along with the sunlight and the energy, is to give you glucose, C6H12O6. I couldn't figure out how to uh, do it correctly. All right, and oxygen as a waste product. Now, what we do with it, and the early aerobic bacteria did with it, is they took the high energy fuel of glucose and the oxygen, made a lot of energy, 38, and carbon dioxide and water, which then became then that could loop into photosynthesis as the products of photosynthesis loop into aerobic respiration. Okay, so that's brilliant. The next is something that we started in lecture on Wednesday. I just want to touch base with this a little bit and just to kind of put it all together in one unit. What now has to happen is for life to get complicated, big, it has to go from a primitive bacterial cell to a more sophisticated eukaryotic cell that has lots of organelles, division of labor, that can cooperate and form tissues, organ systems. So the way that we do it is called symbiogenesis, or the way that life did it. So endo, meaning it happened inside a cell. Symbiosis, means that I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. And then genesis, birth. So the birth inside of a cell of symbiosis. And essentially what happened is you had starvation again, great motivator. And so if you had an anaerobic cell, they tend to be large, and they consumed an aerobic organism, bacteria, then instead of eating it, they cooperated. And that helped the anaerobe because then it wasn't poisoned by the oxygen. It could use the oxygen. And then the aerobic bacteria, which tend to be smaller, are protected by the anaerobe. And that was the beginning of the birth of eukaryotic organisms like our own cells. The new kingdom that was created because of this endosymbiogenesis was the kingdom of Protista, also called Protista, but I like Protista better. Alrighty, so they formed permanent relationships with each other. A chimera in that the cell is half anaerobic, and their DNA is in the nucleus. And then the aerobic bacteria have their DNA, which eventually morphed into the mitochondria. So the mitochondria that we have, once upon a time, was a aerobic bacteria that took shelter inside an anaerobic bacteria. And the fact that they have two different DNAs that are reflective of, like the DNA in the mitochondria, it's about genes that code for mitochondria, and the genes in the nucleus coded for enzymes and metabolic pathways that would contribute to the overall metabolism of the cell. Um, and that merger also occurred with anaerobes and cyanobacteria. So with the cyanobacteria, that eventually became a chloroplast. That is an organelle that plants have because that has the chlorophyll that traps the energy from the sun, etc., etc. So through these merges of bacteria cooperating with each other, but being different from one another, allowed life to gain more complexity, more diversity, and now we're going to get into, that's great, that's metabolism. How about reproduction? So when it says mortalities for the immortal, bacteria, getting back to the bacteria, they clone themselves. They just get large and they divide in half. So there is no gametes, there's no sex, there's no egg and sperm. They really do have to rely on mutation, like coming in contact with radiation, in order to change. So bacteria are actually considered immortal because they can be killed by antibiotics, but the ones that remain can continue. And we have recorded bacteria that are currently living on the planet that have a lifespan of 30 million years, billion years, I'm sorry, 3 billion years. I'll get there. I'm not going to have that on the exam, but that's a long time to live. But the compromise is that they're very, very simple. So when sex was invented, along with endosymbiogenesis, then things rapidly became complicated. Let's see if I can there we go. So it led to the eukaryotic cell. It led to the new kingdom called Protista. And this is just going into the fact that one protist is going to be the algae. And that is because of the merger of the anaerobe with the cyanobacteria. Another protist are the protozoa. And they are like our cells, they are eukaryotic cells. They will lead to the kingdom of Animalia, us. And that started to occur when anaerobes allowed aerobic bacteria to live with them. And just as the cyanobacteria eventually became the chloroplasts and the aerobic eventually became the mitochondria, now you can start to get more complicated. And then the other thing is that the slime molds also had that type of cooperation, and they eventually became the fungi. So the kingdom fungi came from the slime molds, the kingdom planta came from the cyanobacteria, and the kingdom of Animalia came from the protozoa. Okay, so sex, a survival strategy. You don't tend to think about sex as a survival strategy, but it came again because of starvation. And when you have seasons and winter comes and it's difficult to get food, then one way to deal with that until the next spring when things become plentiful is to take your chromosome number and divide it in half. You are actually diploid because you have half the chromosomes of mom and half the chromosomes of dad. So you have a copy of each of those chromosomes. So in order to maximize survival and only have it be diploid when there was a lot of food, that's how sex came about. And it meant then that the protista, the cells, whether they were blue-green algae or slime molds or protozoa, they would take their diploid number, divide it in half, and become haploid in the winter. And then these haploid cells eventually became the eggs and the sperm that would then come together to form a fertilized egg in the spring when the food was plentiful. Because it's a random mingling or mixing of paternal and maternal genes, it means that the offspring are all different. They are all unique. So the problem uh, is that you're going to end up having death be something that goes hand in hand with sex. Because of sexual reproduction, we've gotten large, we've gotten complex. But because of sexual reproduction, we are unique individuals that are born, that live a lifetime, and do have to die. So unlike the bacteria that can be immortal, we cannot. On the other hand, I wouldn't be talking to you about this if all that evolution didn't occur, and it really sprung into place as soon as sex was developed on the planet. And then we were able to get into all of the organisms that we have in a very short period of geological time today. So having said that, this just goes into the reducing of the chromosome number. Favorable conditions return. They're going to come together, the egg and the sperm, the gametes, and then you're going to have all kinds of diversity with your diploid organism. And this is the last slide. So it says, so what is life? Life is the arising of more complex cells. Eukaryotes evolve from symbiosis. Swimming, conjugating, bargaining, dominating bacteria, the kingdom Monera, become a new kingdom, Protista. Inventing meiotic sex, death, and complex multicellularity along the way. So that's that, and I will see you tomorrow for review. Take care.